Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're going to talk about Electimuss. Electimuss is a UK-based luxury perfume brand. I've done a video about such brands if you're interested in the whole phenomenon I call the luxury hustle, several videos back in my catalog. But this is one brand that I would also call guilty of attempting such a luxury hustle on the fragrance buyer. Going after not just the ultra wealthy, as most of these brands do, but in this case taking a bit more of a unique angle by also targeting collectors and connoisseurs, people who may not have as much money overall as the intended buyer for most luxury brands, but the kind of person willing to save up, eat ramen a couple nights a week if they must, to get the money together to pay for one of these overpriced bottles. So targeting that specific demographic, the collector, the connoisseur, the enthusiast, the person who will pour over hours and hours of YouTube videos and spend half a day on Fragrantica or Base Notes or wherever it is they hang their hat, yakking about fragrances. That's the kind of person Electimuss is going after, in addition to the usual ostentatious wealth set, which is the typical target for these brands. So, forming in 2015, Electimuss was originally a very local UK thing. So they were a boutique brand, all right? Not altogether dissimilar to how Rajadov got started with his brand when he first had a salon at the top floor of Harrods, where he would sell both other fragrances and then make some of his own in-house stuff that he would sell as his semi-bespoke range. Eventually that broadened into a full line that was manufactured and sold by Robertet elsewhere. So Electimuss has a similar start, except they were always their own storefront, their own boutique. They didn't have a floor or a salon in Harrods like Raja had, but Raja also had connections to get that space to begin with. So that's a little difference there, but otherwise similar start. And Electimuss has two founders. There's Luke Ranger, who's a marketing director. He is the head of several cosmetics providers in the UK. So he was in the adjacent industry. Again, there's a parallel here because Mark Constantine of Lush fame also got his start in the cosmetics field. And he did stuff with The Body Shop and eventually spun off his own brand called Lush that would focus mostly on handmade fragrances that would go into soaps, perfumes, bath bombs. You know, Lush boutiques are everywhere now. So a little bit of a similar trajectory there. Luke Ranger was a marketing director for cosmetics, and then he teamed up with a guy named Jason Collison, and these two, Jason Collison and Luke Ranger, would then launch Electimuss in 2015. Now, originally the bottles were very small, very plain, gray bottles with actual stickers on them, very lowbrow, low-key stuff, because they were kind of that sort of handmade artisanal thing. That's how it started. They contracted their first handful of fragrances out to a local UK flavor and fragrance firm. Some of you have probably heard of it. It's called CPL, okay? CPL Laboratories. There's a guy who hangs out on Base Notes who is a former CPL perfumer. And he talks about his time there all the time. So they've always been kind of a smaller oil house, sort of like a smaller creative firm, in the same way that Quest used to be before they were bought, right? So CPL did the first handful of fragrances for Electimuss when they were very tiny. And they were distributed mostly through the UK. Like I said, sort of hand to mouth, very, very small, like a lot of your indie brands that you see on Instagram and such, but more personal, more local. Well, eventually that business model grew, and the brand had a bit of a makeover to become more of a proper luxury brand to compete in the same spaces as a lot of these luxury brands like Creed, like the aforementioned Rajadov, like Royal Crown, okay? And similarly, since they also were in the kind of the same wheelhouse as other English-based luxury brands like Thameen and Bodacia the Victorious. I mean, they even used the same chem house. They even used the same flavor firm as both Thameen and Bodacia the Victorious, being CPL, right? So it wasn't a very large stretch of the imagination to continue along those lines, create bottles that were like that in how decorative they are and heavy and substantial, and then create a similar sort of fantastical backstory like Bodacia the Victorious has. So we end up with a more broad launch in 2019 on the global market. And then most of the older fragrances didn't survive. One did, Amber Aqualara survived, and I will talk about that fragrance in a second because I absolutely hate that fragrance. So I've got to talk about it because I hate it. But that one made the transition over to the newer style with the tall bottles and the heavy caps and the little logo in the center like this. So Electimuss as we know it now is unfortunately very analogous to Bodacia the Victorious. Like Bodacia the Victorious, it banks on ancient history, except now we're moving more into the Roman era of history. Electimuss means to choose the best, right? So that's their whole shtick. They're trying to go with the whole Romans loved perfume, and they traded on the Silk Road, and they did this, and they went far and wide for the best materials, and they scented their fountains with rose water and da-da-da-da-da. Julius Caesar was saying "et tu, Brute" while he was wearing ambergris. So he was unalived very fragrantly. He very fragrantly passed away. So I don't know, man. I'm not going there. It's the same claptrap as any other brand of this particular ilk. So Parfum de Marly with the whole Sun King BS, you know, and then Creed where they would select different historical figures and then try and build up stories behind each one of them. This one was Napoleon's fragrance. This one was Jesus of Nazareth's fragrance. Just stop, okay? Just stop. So, in my time reviewing several of the Electimuss fragrances, I found one that was about Cicero. I found one that was about Nero, and I'm just like, okay. I can suspend disbelief that maybe there's a tiny bit of historical something somewhere saying that this person was alleged to like this or that, but you're not going to really convince me that you've made an accurate representation of how this person may have smelled when they haven't been alive for thousands of years. Okay, it's just I'm just not doing that. And a lot of these luxury brands get the thumbs down for me because a lot of them are, as I mentioned in my luxury hustle video, they are just a big swindle. They repackage fragrances that are similar to other high-end brands that are also expensive. So you typically get the BR 541, you get the Tom Ford Oud Wood one, you get the Creed Aventus one. Every one of these brands has to have their token entry in a given field. So whenever a brand launches and they have the luxury bottles and they have all the packaging, you just know out of those 15 available fragrances, they always launch a bigger range right at once. They give you a big spread. You just know that when they launch all these fragrances, one of them is going to be your token Aventus fragrance. One's going to be your token BR 540 fragrance. One's going to be your token Rose Oud of some kind, right? One's going to be your token Delina Candy Rose kind of fragrance for the ladies who want to smell pretty. Like, it's almost like you can just place money on it. You can just place bets, like you're betting on a racehorse. You just know these things are going to come out like this. So Electimuss is kind of half in, half out. So I have to give them credit. They did make some token fragrances. They do have a token Aventus fragrance called Imperium. And they do have some token Rose Ouds as well. Okay. And the Amber Aqualara fragrance, one of their earlier releases actually, when they were still a low-key brand, that one to me just smells like a heavier and more nauseating Enigma / Creation E. So If you're a fan of Enigma and Creation E, you're not going to like what I have to say because I don't like that fragrance either. But I would wear Creation E or Enigma over this because at least that fragrance has some balance, right? Imagine if you took Enigma or Creation E and made it 3 times heavier, 3 times sweeter, make it almost like Ipecac syrup, like what you'd feed someone to make them throw up. Imagine that. So it's like syrup of Ipecac, but as a fragrance. Has all that cola nuance and all that sweet, garbagey, ambery. Oh, God, man. I smelled that and I was just like this. And I can't imagine any self-respecting person who would seriously want to smell like a bottle of Triminic or Robitussin mixed with some old Ipecac. Like, I just can't picture that. But I'm sure somebody out there exists and is willing to pay the exorbitant sum of $500, which is what that fragrance costs. They want $500 to make you smell like some vomit juice. I wish I was joking. But luckily, as I said, they are only 1 foot in and 1 foot out of that particular game. They do have some rather interesting, rather unique fragrances in their range. It isn't all just luxury hustle, as I said. And the good news is some of the fragrances do end up in discounters. They end up in your typical online storefronts, and you can get them for half the price or 60% of the price. So instead of paying that ugly $350, $400, $500 in the case of the Amber Aquilara, you can get some of these for $125, $150, maybe $200, right? So it's like, okay, that's a little more understandable, considering that they are all at 30% concentration of oil. They're all extrait or a pure parfum. So even though you're paying $200, you're getting what's going to be probably a lifetime supply with one bottle. You're never going to re-buy that bottle. You're never going to replace that bottle. You'll buy that one bottle, and that one bottle will be all you need. So I can be a little more reasonable and can meet somebody halfway. If you're giving me a 50% discount, so instead of $400, it's $200, and you're giving me a super strong concentration that I'm never going to run through in my life, $200 for 100 ml of extrait? Okay. That's still a chunk of change, right? But at least I can say I'm not going to want a backup of this. If I love it, I'm not going to need a backup. I can just have this one, and that's it. And that's the same way I justify buying Amouage. Those are all super strong, too. That's the same way I justify buying a lot of those brands. My MFKs are the same way. You get them for half price, and they're stupid strong, but they're half price. So again, it's like you're paying $200, $150, you know, for 100 ml of something that you kind of only really need 50 ml of, right? Only need 60 ml of. So that's okay. So if you're going to discount shop this brand, if you're going to discount shop them, I can actually recommend some. I can approve of some. So again, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So the ones that are actually not your typical luxury hustle fragrances that aren't the clones, of the ones I like, the first one is Black Caviar, which Black Caviar came out in 2019, 2020. It was one of those global launch fragrances. When the brand went global, this one came out. Now, I've mentioned Black Caviar in other videos, and I've talked about it effectively smelling like the original brief as intended for Paco Rabanne Invictus, how that was meant to be a very waxy, oily, salty representation of like a black olive, right? They developed a black olive accord, and they were going to build the fragrance around that, but because it's a commercial fragrance, it's Paco Rabanne, for crying out loud, right? So they just kept reworking it, and it got very sweet, bubblegummy, bay leaf got shoved in there. So it became this very commercial thing. And even though that black olive accord was still there, it was just buried underneath everything else. Tragically, it's like a really good steak, but that really good steak is covered in too much sauce and onions and everything else. So you bury the flavor of the steak. That is what happened to Paco Rabanne and Invictus. It had a very good core, a very good heart, but it was buried with too much condiments. It was overworked. Now, Black Caviar seems to rectify that. I'm not saying it's an unused mod from Paco Rabanne brief process for Invictus, but I'm saying it smells like it could be, because it has the same waxy, oily, black olive style note, but they call it caviar, right? Black caviar. But it's that same salty, oily feeling, but now you've got a drier, fresher, more mature fougere accord. And that drier, fresher, more leathery fougere accord sits on top of the waxy, oily black olive vibe, which means you get to smell a lot more. You get to smell a lot more of that salty, rubbery goodness, which makes Black Caviar, in my mind's eye, feel more like what Paco Rabanne Invictus could have been. But you pay the premium because it's Electimuss, so you pay that, $300 some odd for it. Or again, if you get it discounted, $1.25, $1.50, wherever you find it. Just make sure you don't get a fake, of course. You run the risk of fakes with brands like that. Next up from this range, I would say Vixaire is pretty good. Vixaire is kind of the soft, orrisy, irisy, pillowy fragrance. And it's got a nice white musk profile. It's got a nice rounded ylang-ylang note in it. It's a very floral fragrance. So a lot of you like He-Man guys, the real macho, or I can't wear no, nothing gotta be all super manly. You wouldn't like this fragrance. But that's okay. You can sit this one out. For the rest of you, a little more open-minded, Vixaire is actually pretty nice. It kind of smells almost like a what if. Like if you were to take something like Versace the Dreamer, right? Take something like that and pull out the tobacco from the Dreamer and put a softer, pillowy, more sort of rounded white musk treatment and put more ylang-ylang in there, more white floral materials. Bend it more towards unisex. If you think that would smell good to you, then Electimuss has a fragrance. Now, they do have some nice ouds, okay? The problem is the ouds tend to be too much like what other brands are already doing for less money. Once again, it becomes a value proposition conundrum. So they've got Celestia, and Celestia is like the sort of tannin heavy, sourish kind of oud fragrance, but it just ends up being like a Montal Mancera experience. It has that same kind of Firmenich sort of oud molecule that was in Dior Leather Oud, that's in Le Labo Oud 27. It even made its way all the way down to Jovan. Jovan had a fragrance called Intense Oud. And Jovan Intense Oud had this same sort of slightly phenolic but also petrolish kind of vibe to the oud. And it's here in the Celestia. So it's like Celestial, I think it's called. Celestial, not Celestia. So while I like Celestial, I'm also left wondering, well, I'm paying $200 some odd, $300 for this when I can just get Montal Attar, Montal Attar for a third of that price, right? $125 retail, $150 at most, $65, $70 discounted. So I could just buy the Montal. And I actually think the Montal has a higher quality smell than the Celestial does. So again, it's the value proposition that I run afoul of. And then we have another fragrance called Aurora. And Aurora is really nice. So Aurora is sort of like the what if raspberry rose oud with no oud. Which makes you go, huh? Wouldn't that be too floral? You might think so. But the perfumer, Sofia Bardelli, who also works for CPL, she did a real clever trick here. She basically took that whole raspberry, framboinon, rose, patchouli oud. And she pulls out the oud, doesn't have any oud in the fragrance, and instead she puts in Gaiac wood. She puts in more of a classic women's floral chypre profile with the resins and the yellow florals, so the tuberose is in there. Okay, again, Mugit Ylang Ylang is in there. So it gives you that contemporary raspberry rose patchouli-ish opening with saffron, but then once you get into the base, it feels more classic. It feels more like a 80s fragrance, maybe early 90s. For me, that was a pleasant surprise. So I said, okay, one more I can say is worth investigating from this brand. But ultimately, the verdict with Electimuss is they really are just like Bodacious the Victorious, Bond Number 9. Again, I can say all these names, Royal Crown, you've heard them all. Really expensive bottles, fancy packaging, and even though they do have some interesting creative fragrances, there's a whole lot of theirs I have not smelled, by the way, like, you know, Patchouli of the Underworld, for example. I haven't been able to get my hands on a sample of that, but so there could be a lot more buried treasures in this brand that I haven't sampled. But by and large, it is a bit of a minefield. It's a bit of a minefield concerning which ones are going to be luxury smell-alikes, which ones are going to be truly unique and worth investigating. It's hit or miss unless you have the whole thing in front of you to actually try. But I wanted to give a fair shake to this house. I don't want to dismiss it, and thus I haven't dismissed it. I've given you the most honest opinion I can give you of this brand, having not paid a thing for these samples. These samples were all free from a store that carries the range. They said, here's these samples. Check this house out. Say what you want. We don't care. We're not endorsed, so I could just let her rip and think what I want to think. And that Amber Aquilara is just straight trash. It is just straight trash, man. That is like the most expensive bottle of trash I've ever smelled. But on the flip side of that coin, Black Caviar, very good. Vixair, very good. Aurora, very nice. Okay, so there are some gems in this range that are worth looking into. And then last but not least, I want to make note of the fact that this brand hilariously tried to call themselves accessible in the beginning. When they first launched, their website talked about how they tried to give collectors and connoisseurs more value for their money by giving them higher grade materials for prices that are lower than other niche brands. But they said that when they were all selling for about $225. When they first introduced and they were all around $225, they were kind of playing the value for money game. But of course, you know what happens. All these brands mark up and mark up and mark up, and now they're sitting around that $350 up to $500. So they very quietly went into their website and they erased that part. So they don't talk about the value anymore. Now it's just luxury and prestige and status and all the usual bull fucking shit that you expect from these kind of brands. So that to me felt a little bit inauthentic. I felt that was a bit disingenuous on their part to try and sell you on value and to pull the rug out from under you when the prices went up. You know, I don't like a bait and switch. Bait and switch is a very, very old hustle that we used to do on the sales floor at Sears. I didn't do it, but we were trained to do it. Upsell to a more expensive model. The cheap one is always out of stock. You can never get the cheap one, so upsell them to a more expensive model. I never played that game. I would let them walk. I would just let them walk. So when brands do that, when they come in low, get your faith, get your trust, and then shoot you high later, that always puts me on the defense, man. Always. So there you guys go. That is Electimuss of London. Go check them out if you want to. Just know what you're getting into. Thanks for watching. This has been The On List.